Well, hello everyone. This is Pastor Dave here with our second lesson. And this week we're looking at where the Old Testament comes from, specifically the manuscripts that we use to create our English translations of the Old Testament. This sort of gets us into ancient history and discovering manuscripts and manuscript families, and hopefully by the end of this you'll have a pretty good knowledge of exactly where we get our New Testament. So, what is the Old Testament? Well, there are different Old Testaments. The Protestant Old Testament is different than the Catholic Old Testament. And so starting off, the Protestant Old Testament has 39 books. The languages that are used for the Old Testament are Hebrew and Aramaic. It's almost all Hebrew. The book of Ezra and most of Daniel are written in Aramaic, which is a language very similar to Hebrew, but that's it. So it's all Aramaic except for a couple of books. Sorry, it's all Hebrew except for a couple of books are in Aramaic. That's the language it's written in. And it is the storyline of the Old Testament is the history of the Israelites from creation to their return from exile. And it's probably something you know, but just we're covering the basics here. When it was written, well, probably it goes back to the 15th century, is when the earliest pieces of the Old Testament were written at that time. And then the writing process began back in the 1400s BC, and it continued all the way up until around the year 400 BC. So it took about 1,000 years to write the Old Testament, which is interesting because the New Testament, it only took about 50 years for that to be written. The divisions, the way that it is arranged, you have it's just like the Roman Catholic Old Testament, same arrangement. You have the Pentateuch, or the books of Moses, come first, and that's followed by the historical books: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. And then after that, you have wisdom, the wisdom books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and then the prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So that's the arrangement. And this is an interesting point. The Protestant Old Testament is identical to the Jewish Bible, or the books that they use within Judaism. However, our arrangement is different. We have the same books, but we arrange them differently. For example, in the Jewish Bible, the last book they have is not Malachi, it is Chronicles. So, and there's a reason why we have the exact same book as the Jewish Bible. It has to do with Martin Luther. So, moving on. So there's the just the breakdown of what these things look like. Now, the Catholic Old Testament, this will all be very similar. They have 7 additional books. So they have 46 books instead of 39. And their books are written, it's just like ours, Hebrew and Aramaic, but they also have some of their books, Old Testament books, were written in the Greek language. And this will bring back last week's lesson where we talked about Alexander the Great. Conquering the Persians, and the Greek language spread far and wide. And for this reason, we have Jewish people speaking Greek around the year 200 when some of these books are written. So Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The storyline, it's similar to the Protestant Old Testament, but it goes a little farther along in history. So it's the history of the Israelites and Jews from creation until the Greek period. So after the Persians, the Greek period. So it's a little, their storyline is a little longer. And when it was written, it's just like the Protestant Old Testament. It goes back to the 1400s BC. But instead of stopping in the Persian period, they stop in the Greek period. Their division, just like the Protestant, you have the Pentateuch, historical books, and then poetry and wisdom, and then the prophets. They have 7 more books than the Protestants. This is where we have some differences. And all of the books that are in the additional books in the Catholic Old Testament, which we call the Apocrypha, some people call them the Deuterocanonical books, these books were either written in Greek or they survive in Greek. Sorry, my thing has a mind of its own here. So the books of Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Judith, Tobit, these things were all, they survive in Greek. Okay, the storyline, as this, we had this previously, it goes up and through the Greek period. Okay, so we had the same slide twice. Sorry about that. There's the, this is what it looks like. And so if you look on this page, you will see in the historical books down here, oh, we got 1 and 2 Maccabees, or up here we've got Tobit and Judith. And in Poetry and Wisdom, you'll see the Wisdom of Solomon and another book called Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. And there's also Baruch and additions to Daniel and things like this. Okay. So those are the canons of the Old Testament. Canon, sometimes you'll hear about saints becoming canonized in the Catholic religion, or maybe you know of the camera company Canon. Canon is related to the word for cane, and it means the standard measure, because they used to measure with canes. And so kaneh in Hebrew or kana in Greek means cane or measure. And what's the official measure of our Bible? What books are in, which books are out? And so this here is the Catholic canon, but there's also the Protestant canon. So that's how they're different. Now we'll look at the manuscripts, and this will tell us why they're different. And when you examine manuscripts and what the actual text of the Bible is, they call that textual criticism. And you should think of criticism as a way of, it's critically determining what the original text would have been. It's not like, oh, you're pretty critical, like they're, chastising, but it's thinking critically over what the original text should be. That's textual criticism. Now, the most important manuscript family that exists for the Protestant, well, for the Old Testament, for Catholics and for Protestants, is a family of manuscripts called the Masoretic text. And this tradition comes out of Judaism. And it's sort of, well, we'll get to the time frame in a second here. These manuscripts are Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts, which is good because it's a manuscript tradition that continues in the language in which these things were written. Because as we will see in a second, there are ancient translations that people will use to figure out what the text should be. But the Masoretic text is a Hebrew and Aramaic tradition. The manuscripts that survive for the Masoretic text are the exact same books that we have in the Protestant Old Testament. So the same 39 books as the Protestant Old Testament. Here's what is very good about the Masoretic text. It is in the original language, as we said, because as soon as you translate something, well, now you have to, and you have that translation, you have to think backwards to what the original was. So if you learn Hebrew and you're looking at an English translation, you can guess what the Hebrew would have been behind it, but it's not exactly clear. And so it's great that the Masoretic text is in the original language. And another thing that's very good about this text is that it is very reliable, remarkably reliable. And we'll learn more about that in a second when we come to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it's a very reliable way of copying this tradition. The bad thing about the Masoretic text is these manuscripts come from a late time period. They come from, even though it's manuscripts for the Old Testament, the actual pieces of parchment or the pieces of leather that these things were written on come from around the year AD 1000, right? So they come long after Jesus. They come from a medieval time period. And so that's what's bad. So there's good and bad with all of these things, and there's the good, there's the bad. Let me move my face here. The English Old Testament is mostly based upon the Masoretic text. So when you read your Old Testament, you're basically reading a translation from the Masoretic text. So it's the most important manuscript tradition. Yeah, and if you want to know what the Hebrew has, you consult a critical edition of the Masoretic text. Well, here, I'll grab one. So if we're in the book of Genesis and we want to know what Genesis says, so we turn to, Genesis, that might be mirrored. And then there you have the critical edition of the text. And this is how we know what's in the Bible, mostly. There's just an image of what this would have looked like. Of course, that might not really look like anything to you all, but you'll notice in the sides, hopefully my arrow shows up here on the page. On the sides, they have all these notes, and at the top, they have all these notes, and on this side, they have all these notes, and on the bottom, they have all these notes. If there's anything unusual in the text, they would make a note on the side of the page, letting people know that, hey, here's an unusual spelling, here's an unusual word. Copy it just as it is. Even though it's unusual to you, it should be the way it is. So don't change it. So they had lots of notes written on every page in a very systematic and precise way to make sure it was copied just as it is, and it should not be changed, which is very important because as time moves on, language changes, right? Like if you were to copy Shakespeare's works for somebody else, you might update the language, and the Masoretes were very good at preserving what was originally in there. All right, now moving on to the next manuscript family, there's a Greek family of manuscripts known as the Septuagint. We talked about them briefly last week. So the Septuagint is an ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. And it comes from, the translations began back in the 200s BC. So it's an ancient translation that existed before the days of the New Testament. So this translation developed in the intertestamental time period. And the translations were made in the city of Alexandria, which is in Egypt. But notice the name, Alexandria. It's a Greek city that Alexander started, and he thought he would name it after himself, Alexandria. So it's an ancient Greek translation. All right, moving on. The Apocrypha, as we said before, the books that are in the Catholic Old Testament were written in Greek, or they survive in Greek. And so this is where we get the Apocrypha. So the translations in the Catholic Old Testament for their apocryphal books come from Septuagint manuscripts. This was the first Bible of the church. Oftentimes when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, they're quoting from this ancient Greek translation. So it's a very important translation to the church, even just for that reason. What is good about this? I'll tell you what's good about it. The good is that though the manuscripts come from a later time period, we have a good guess of what the text looked like before Christ. So it's almost like translating the text in the year 200 BC. It sort of froze what the text looked like over 2,000 years ago. So that ancient translation has a way of getting us back to a time period that's before the Masoretic text. And so though the manuscripts come later in their Greek, we get a good snapshot of what that earlier text would have been. And here's what's bad about it. What's bad is it's a translation, and it separates us from the original text by one step. Okay, here's an image of a famous, the Mount Sinai Codex. There's a monastery in Egypt known as Mount Sinai, and they found a copy of the Bible. And this was a Greek Bible that went from Genesis through the New Testament. So it was a complete Greek Bible, start to finish. And they call it Codex. Codex is a Latin word for book. And so they call it Codex Sinaiticus, or the book from Mount Sinai would be an English translation of that Latin phrase. And there you have an idea of what it looked like. One thing you might want to take notice of, and the New Testament manuscripts are this way too, it's written in all, we would call them capital letters. In Greek, they would call them unchol. It's written in all capital letters, and there are no spaces between the words. When it would come time for the line to break and you'd have to start writing on the line below, they would break in a syllable or at the end of a word, but otherwise it's all capitals, all smushed together, and you would have to do the punctuating and the word separation yourself. It's just sort of a crazy feature of what translations or manuscripts were like. Now, the last family that we'll look at, hopefully you're not too confused. We've got the Masoretic text, those Hebrew manuscripts, then we've got those Greek manuscripts called the Septuagint. There's another text called, a family of manuscripts called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what you see before you on the screen right here is a copy of Isaiah 53. And you are looking at handwriting. This handwriting is over 2,000 years old, which is really just remarkable. And in fact, right here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but right here is the Hebrew phrase, Micholel Mifsha'enu Umduka Me'avone. I've got the Hebrew here to translate for you. Me'avonetenu Musar, Shlomenu Alav Uvachavurato Nipalanu. Okay, sorry, I should have practiced that beforehand, but he was pierced through our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. So this manuscript in front of you is that verse, well, that chapter, Isaiah 53, the story of the suffering servant in Isaiah. And you're looking at the handwriting of a person who lived over 2,000 years ago. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, what are they besides very interesting and awesome? These are manuscripts that were discovered in caves in the deserts of Judea in the 1940s and in the 1950s. Right? Once upon a time, there was a Muslim Bedouin boy who threw a rock into a cave, and he heard something break, and he went in and he found jars, and they contained manuscripts that had been sitting there for about 2,000 years. And eventually, these were put into the hands of academic scholars who began to make sense out of what they had here exactly. They think that the manuscripts were put there by a group of Jewish people known as the Essenes, and this Jewish group, it'd be like the Pharisees or the Sadducees, but they were different than both of those. It's another Jewish sect or another Jewish denomination. And these Essenes are talked about by a number of Roman historians, and then most famously by the Jewish historian Josephus. We talked about him last week with the Jewish War. So the Essenes, they are an extinct Jewish sect. They were chased away or killed in the war against the Romans in AD 70. But prior to that, for a couple hundred years, they lived in the desert in sort of a compound. And they copied manuscripts, and they created, so they preserved and created manuscripts. Many of them were biblical manuscripts. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls are many, many biblical manuscripts, and they exhibit a variety of traditions. That is to say, some of the manuscripts, the Hebrew in them look just like the Masoretic manuscripts. And then some of the Hebrew manuscripts sort of follow along with the Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament, because the Masoretic text and the Greek text aren't absolutely identical. There are some slight differences between them. So you got the Masoretic text, you've got the Septuagint, you've got the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's talk about the communities where these things come from, and we'll wrap it up. So what forms of Judaism survived the first Jewish revolt in AD 70? Well, the rabbis survived, right? Or the Pharisees survived. And after the Jewish revolt, Pharisaic Judaism evolved into Rabbinic Judaism. And the main difference between the two is that the rabbis no longer wanted to kill the Romans and set up a Jewish political state. So they survived, and the Christians survived. The Essenes, who give us the Dead Sea Scrolls, they did not survive. And so the rabbis, they give us the Masoretic text. And Christianity provides us with the Septuagint. What are some things we should take away from all this information? And talking about manuscript traditions, it's not real exciting. It might be considered a little boring, but it's where we get our Bible. Like, where does the Bible come from? I've got many English translations, and I know where these English translations come from. I can follow it back to the original source. And really, that's with all of our thinking, with all of our knowledge, we should be able to trace things back to where they started. And then we can have great confidence and certainty in what we know. We know what we know, and we know how we know it. And we don't have to be blown around with the winds of change because we know what is certain. So anyway, that's my sales pitch for this stuff. One takeaway would be that for thousands of years, people of faith had been taking great care of our sacred scripture. Now, I mentioned these manuscript families, and you might think like, well, there's 3 manuscripts of the Old Testament, but there's not. There's thousands. I mean, there's hundreds of manuscripts in each of these traditions. And when you add them all up, it's thousands of manuscripts that you can compare and contrast and use to have almost total certainty on what the original was. Because for thousands of years, people have been in painstaking ways taking great care of this text. It's really wonderful. And it's you know, I have feelings of gratitude and wonder at these folks who preserve these things in monasteries and libraries and took great care so that we can have them today. And it's because of their efforts that we do have the text, right? It's inspired by God, but it's been preserved by humanity. And that was great. Of course, God was at work in the preservation of Scripture too, I believe. So that's one takeaway. Another takeaway would be our biblical text is extremely reliable. Whenever we can check on the text, it proves excellent. And this is my opinion. In studying manuscripts, for my PhD work, that's what I spent a lot of time doing. So in particular, the Aramaic manuscripts and the Latin manuscripts, and we haven't talked to any, we haven't even mentioned those. There's also Latin traditions, there's Aramaic traditions, there's Syriac traditions. All those families of manuscripts can also be examined to better understand our text. Whenever we can check on the text, it proves to be reliable. And so the biblical text isn't something that somebody just cooked up one day and it's full of errors. It's not. It was written a long time ago, and it was copied very early, and it was copied very often, and we have a very reliable text. And also, the Bible is unlike any other text on earth. Among ancient texts, there is nothing like it. Let me give you one example. You've probably heard of Julius Caesar, right? The month of July is named after this Roman emperor. And Julius Caesar would go to war against the Gauls, the people in Germany and France and Northern Europe. And he had great trouble against them. He was very hard, because they were so organized, they were hard to defeat. And he wrote a book called The Gallic Wars. And it's written by Julius Caesar about his wars against the Europeans. And guess how many manuscripts we have for this thing? There are 9 manuscripts that survive. And for the Old Testament and for the New Testament, we have thousands. I mean, there's nothing like it. The Bible is absolutely unique. And of course, we live in a day and age where people say, well, Christianity, it's just another world religion. There's so many other things that are just like it. I don't think there is. There's nothing like sacred scripture. No other manuscript tradition is like it. And that, to me, points to our Creator and how He has been at work. And that's a wonderful thing. Well, anyway, I hope you all are holding up well. Miss you all. It's weird being in this church by myself. I look forward to the day when you're back in here and we can worship together and talk about these things face to face. So anyway, have a great day. We'll talk to you later. God bless.